Dr. Steven Greer gives a very impressive interview discussing the scope and significance of UFO-related disclosure initiatives he's publicly shared over the last 3 decades. The planned destruction of the International Space Station and its replacement by commercial space stations has some big drawbacks. The FAA has approved plans for construction of a Las Vegas Spaceport. Galactic History, according to lion and bird people races, Kazakhstan becomes the 12th country to sign China's International Lunar Research Station initiatives. These stories and more on Exopolitics Today, the Week in Review.
You're listening to Exopolitics Today with Dr. Michael Salla, your source for the uncensored truth regarding the human, extraterrestrial, global, and political agenda. Click the like button and subscribe to this channel. And now, here's Dr. Michael Salla.
Well, welcome to Exopolitics Today, the Week in Review. Today is July 6th, and I am shooting out of Lyon, France. I am here for a conference, and it is a very interesting conference. I'll give you more details in next week's Week in Review, but I'm going to be talking about revelations by JP and some of the most recent information concerning secret space programs, extraterrestrial contact, and the future of our planet, but more on that later. So let me begin with my Twitter feed for this week. And on June 30, I put out a tweet about Dr. Steven Greer, a interview he did on this podcast channel, PBD, and it really was an excellent interview. Dr. Steven Greer, for those that don't know, he started the Disclosure Project process in 2001, or at least he launched the Disclosure Project press conference in 2001 that got so many people really fascinated by the UFO disclosures by whistleblowers. And he has ever since been advocating that these whistleblower testimonies are real and they need to be examined. Now, he was really one of the major individuals behind getting a lot of former military and government agency whistleblowers to come forward. And more recently, we have had a new cadre of whistleblowers. People think of David Grush, David Fravor, and others associated with some of the journalists like Ross Coulthart, Michael Schellenberger, George Knapp, who have been looking at whistleblowers. Now, Steven Greer, he's amassed quite a database of whistleblowers going back to the early 1990s. I mean, I think he began around 1991, and he had contact with some extraterrestrials, and he was very quickly taken seriously by the military intelligence community for the simple reason that he was having contact and he was able to summon UFOs. He says that the 1997 Phoenix Lights incident was due to him summoning the UFOs. But from my research in Dr. Greer, he very early on was actually able to summon ETs. He was in contact with them. He's written several books. Hidden Truth, Forbidden Knowledge is the one that I think goes into the greatest detail into his background. So he is a very impressive individual overall. And, you know, we do have our disagreements on things, but overall, the areas of agreement between him and I are really much more significant than our disagreements over different ET races and motivations. But I think what he's done in terms of exposing the extent to which the military intelligence community, the secret government controls the information, censors it, and intimidates whistleblowers or inventors. I think all of that is very, very important. And his understanding of the scope of the cover-up and the agencies involved and how they do it is really superb. And when you compare that with the information coming from some of those other individuals that I've been talking about, I mean, he really stands head and shoulders above others that I just mentioned. But the unfortunate thing is the people that are today getting a lot of mainstream media attention, they are ignoring Greer. And I think it's because he goes very deep into the nature and the individuals associated with the shadow government who are controlling all of this. Whereas those individuals that are getting a lot of media exposure today, they tend to focus on the UFO phenomenon, the existence of crash retrieval programs, different corporations involved, but they kind of say that these programs have been unsuccessful, even though non-human intelligence has been involved. Whereas the information Greer has been able to get matches my own, which is that the capture and reverse engineering of extraterrestrial technologies, non-human intelligence has been successful. And so many of the so-called UFOs that are up there, the majority of those belong to various corporate-built secret space programs. So I think he's really someone that needs to be taken seriously. And in this interview, it goes for 2.5 hours. It is well worth watching the full thing. Now, I want to shift over to the planned destruction of the International Space Station and its replacement by commercial space stations. So this is based on a story from Sky News saying that SpaceX was given permission to destroy the International Space Station, that by 2030, the International Space Station is scheduled to be abandoned by the coalition of countries that are presently involved with that. And the agreement is that a future space station is going to be something that is run by corporations, that there's not going to be a future NASA space station. And that has some pretty big drawbacks. Now, a couple that I mentioned in my tweet is that the International Space Station, because it was controlled by NASA and the European Space Station, I mean, they definitely censored information of what was being seen and witnessed through the different cameras that were being live fed to the internet, to the international community. But you could go to the International Space Station website and you could see the live feed. And often what would happen, and many researchers saw this, that when there was an anomaly, a UFO that came into the live stream would very shortly after that go down or freeze or require maintenance. And then that was how they covered up what was being seen up there by the International Space Station. And also we had an idea of what scientific experiments were being conducted in the International Space Station. That was more a public science process where there were a lot of civilian scientists involved. And this was something that was, at the very least, known to the public. And the other aspect of NASA being involved in the running of the International Space Station is that NASA being a government agency, it meant that all NASA records could be accessed by the Freedom of Information Act. So these are all reasons why having a government-run space station actually is a good thing. Or in the case of the ISS, it was European Space Agency, NASA, and I think the Japanese Space Agency was involved, as well as other countries. but because it was a government run, then you could have all these things happening, even though they were often covering up some of the data concerning UFOs. Now we shift gears now to a future, say 2030 and beyond, where there's not going to be a NASA-run space station. What you'll have are commercial space stations. Now, what is the unfortunate thing about that is that with commercial space stations, for a start, you're not going to have Freedom of Information Act being applicable to things that are happening on that commercial run space station. Live feeds, well, totally up to the commercial entity. Now, it may be more forthcoming, less forthcoming, but I suspect that with a corporation, they would have a very high interest in kind of like taking control of what is being sent to the public. Now, I don't want to say they'll be less forthcoming in terms of their live feeds, but certainly I think with NASA, there was a live feed and the public could demand that, and NASA was very agreeable to that. Now, if a corporation decides it wants to not have a live feed or shut it down for any length of time, there's not really that much the public can do about that. Now, when it comes to science experiments on commercially run space stations, that's where there's going to be a big difference with NASA. NASA did have a process whereby the public could bid or could know what was being scientifically conducted on the International Space Station. With a corporation, given its proprietary interests, it's unlikely that they're going to be very forthcoming at all when it comes to the science projects that are being conducted up there. Now, they might let a few projects be known, kind of like public interest type projects that might affect, say, school kids, and televise that. That's good PR. But in terms of like cutting edge programs, cutting edge science related programs, I can't imagine corporations being as forthcoming just because of the proprietary interests that corporations have on scientific experiments. I mean, they don't want their rivals to know what they're doing in space, let alone show the results of such projects. So yeah, there are some big drawbacks with having a international space station replaced by commercial entities. So that's going to be happening by 2030, and SpaceX won the contract to do that. So that's good for SpaceX, but I think that the prospect of commercially run space stations being all that the public can kind of tap into to get information of what's happening in Earth orbit, that is not necessarily a good thing. Of course, space tourism is going to be a big thing. Now, it might not matter if you have commercial space stations, commercial cruisers, people have their phones up there, smartphones, and they're capturing all sorts of things. So we'll see. But right now, I think that there are some big drawbacks with replacing a government-run International Space Station with a corporate-run version. All right, so here is my next webinar. That is faking a crypto-terrestrial invasion. That's scheduled for July 27. Now, I did a webinar earlier in 2024 this year where I discussed different crypto-terrestrial civilizations that have been on Earth for many millennia, even millions of years. What I have noticed more recently is that there has been a surge of official interest in crypto-terrestrials in terms of that being a feasible form of life that might be behind the UFO phenomenon. And the UFO phenomenon is still being presented as a national security threat. And so it really became clear to me the more I looked at the recent media stories covering crypto-terrestrials, the possibility that crypto-terrestrials could be involved in some kind of hostile actions against surface humanity, and that this was getting a lot of exposure, I realized that this would be a very clever way for the deep state to play its alien false flag card. Now, I'm sure many of you watching this, you're familiar with Carol Rosen's warning given to her by Dr. Werner von Braun, where he said that after a succession of false flag events that the deep state would contrive, that they would finish with a fake alien invasion. Now, that's been around for well over 20 years now, and the public is very prepared for this. Researchers, I think, would kind of like jump up and down if all of a sudden there was an attempt to portray the Earth being under attack by hostile aliens. But I think when it comes to cryptoterrestrials, we're talking not so much invading aliens from another world that the public has been kind of like alerted to by researchers as very likely being a false flag event. The general public isn't very familiar with cryptoterrestrials at all. So all of a sudden, if you had cryptoterrestrials presumably being involved in hostile attacks all over the United States, then that would be something that a lot of UFO researchers wouldn't really know too much about. They wouldn't be that prepared for it. And the big thing is, and the reason I decided to do this webinar is that my research, again and again, I've come across researchers and whistleblowers and witnesses saying that there are these deep underground military bases, DUNs, all over the United States, all over the world, and that many of these facilities have cloned cloning laboratories, and that they're able to clone aliens or greys or other types of alien beings. But this is where you get the so-called programmed life forms that Steven Greer has been talking about for decades, that these deep underground military bases have thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, and even millions of clones that they could deploy as part of a false flag event. So that's what I'm going to be discussing in my Faking a Cryptoterrestrial Invasion webinar on July 26th. I'm going to present all the data about this and cloning of extraterrestrials, captured extraterrestrials. I mean, it goes back to the 1970s. That's how far back it goes. So I'll be presenting the data that I have on that. So that's a not to be missed webinar. I hope you can join me on July 27, and you can register now. Just go to exopolitics.org and the links will be there. Now, Elena Danaan did a Star Nations News recently where she delivered a very compelling message about Maria Orsic that was given to her by Thor Han Eredyon, who's her primary contact with the Galactic Federation of Worlds. Now, the information given to her by Thor Han was that Maria Orsic was first contacted by a deceptive group of human-looking extraterrestrials from the Aldebaran star system. And they contacted her in the early 20s, and they were joined by another group of deceptive human-looking extraterrestrials from Alcyon. And these extraterrestrials were working with the Nazis, Nazi Germany, which had reached agreements with Draco reptilians sometime in the 1930s. And so what you have during the time that Maria Orsic began working with these human-looking extraterrestrials in the 1920s, then 1933, the Nazis come to power, and they take over Orsic's projects, the Vril project, and the Nazis soon after that they sign agreements with these Draco reptilians. Well, apparently those Draco reptilians were already working with those human-looking groups from Aldebaran and from the Alcyon star system that had made contact with Maria Orsic. Now, and in this update from Thor Han, he describes how Osich's whereabouts after the Second World War or at the end of the Second World War were cloaked from remote viewers so that the Dark Fleet and the Draco wouldn't know what was going on. Now, this is very interesting because Dick Allgaier, he did a remote viewing session while he was part of a team doing a remote viewing session of Maria Orsic, and they found that she was very real. And Dick Allgaier in particular, he was able to see and describe in vivid terms the capture rate and execution of Maria Orsic by Soviet occupation troops at the end of the Second World War. Now, according to the information from Elena Danaan, that actually could have involved a clone of Osich. It may have been information that was some part of this kind of shield that the Galactic Federation used to hide her whereabouts, hide what really happened to her. And then what Thor Han went on to describe was that Maria Orsic was used by the Galactic Federation to infiltrate to kind of like enter into or give assistance to the US Navy in developing a secret space program by joining corporations like Douglas Aircraft Company, where she used the pseudonym Jessica. So this is the very same Jessica that William Tompkins talked about in Selected by Extraterrestrials. And he described Jessica as a very beautiful woman, incredibly intelligent, that was helping him and other designers at Douglas Aircraft Company to come up with feasible designs for future space carriers that would be built by the US Navy, working with different corporations like Douglas. And so he described that process and how Jessica was one of these extraterrestrials that were associated with this Nordic group. That's all William Tompkins ever referred to. He just described them as Nordics. Now, according to Elena Danaan, and I think she's correct, that what William Tompkins was referring to was the one and the same Galactic Federation of Worlds. And I have spoken about this to Dr. Robert Wood, who was the original editor of the Bill Tompkins material in Selected by Extraterrestrials, and he agreed with me that, yes, that the Nordics Bill Tompkins talked about were in fact the same group that we today would describe, or have been described by Elena Danaan as the Galactic Federation of Worlds. So, and there's more information about Maria Orsic in terms of her interacting with some contactees such as Jean-Charles Moyen. David Rousseau is another French contactee who's had interactions with Maria Orsic on the Solaris spacecraft, which is part of the Solar Warden fleet. So fascinating information about Maria Orsic. I think what I would get from Thor Han's information is that she continues to operate today, and in this post-war period where she helped the Solar Warden program, she was identified as Jessica. And one additional point, William Tompkins, when he saw a picture of Maria Orsic in my book on Insiders Reveal Secret Space Programs, he saw a picture of Maria Orsic in that. He said, "Holy cow, that's Jessica." And that was confirmation that Maria Orsic actually had continued to operate on Earth after her activities in Germany, both prior to and during the Nazi occupational rule, that she continued to operate after that period. So here are the highlights from my June 15 webinar. This webinar dealt with extraterrestrial gods among us. I talked about my field trip to Egypt, some of the photos and videos I took during that field trip. I showed those in this webinar. And so here we have a trailer that was, or the highlights that was put together by my videographer, Jazz Marlin. So thanks to Jazz for doing that. And yeah, so this is, I think, very helpful to understand the role of the Egyptian gods. Now, I do believe that the Egyptian gods were extraterrestrials, and that they were by and large separate to the Anunnaki in Sumeria, that they were different to the Greek gods, that while there was some overlap, by and large, I think that the Earth was divvied up into these different territories where different extraterrestrial groups or gods would come in and take control. And you actually have sources like Herodotus talking about this, where he describes the scene where on Mount Olympus, where the different territories of Earth were kind of like thrown out like lots, and the different gods would pick a territory, and that they would actually have power over that territory. So I think that the Egyptian gods were distinct to the other gods, while there is some overlap. And this is why I think when you look at, to my mind, the Egyptian gods, when we compare them to say the Anunnaki, I think the Anunnaki were much more into power games. There was a lot of conflict, a lot of struggle. And that's not to say that you didn't have positive Anunnaki. I think that the Ea or Enki faction was very positive, but nevertheless you had the Enlil faction and others associated with that were very power hungry, that they did try to conquer the territories and the peoples belonging to rivals, belonging to, say, the Enki faction and so forth. But what I look at in Egypt was that their culture was, and the way in which the different gods there operated, that there was much more cooperation. There was a much more cooperative relationship between the different gods. And here we're talking about Hathor, the Hathors, the Horus, Sobek, you have the Sekhmet, the lion people. I think that there was a lot of cooperation among these different groups in the Egyptian pantheon. So anyway, I think that they were all extraterrestrials, and so that is all very helpful for us to know what is going on. So the Federal Aviation Authority in the United States has approved plans for the construction of a Las Vegas Spaceport. Now, in this story, here's an MSN story that covers this FAA approval. It's quite clear that the organization that was able to get FAA approval and was able to get the Clark County in Nevada to approve their plans to build a spaceport, that they are still trying to raise the money to build this spaceport. And there are other planned spaceports around the world that funding is being raised to build these. And of course, we know with SpaceX, Elon Musk is building a lot of infrastructure for his SpaceX and future moon trips or Mars trips. And so there are all these spaceports being built. Now, this is being done using conventional rocket propulsion technology. And I think that what we are going to be witnessing over the next half dozen years or so, right up until the end of the 2020s, is that a lot of these exotic propulsion systems that have been suppressed, they're going to be released. Now, I think the way they're going to do this is not so much say, well, sorry, we've had these technologies under development since the 1980s and so forth, and now we're deciding because we have new leaders to release all of this, declassify all this. Now, I think the corporations that develop these technologies, they really have strong proprietary reasons for why they would not release exotic propulsion systems that they were developing going all the way back to the 1980s and 70s, even earlier than that, and 60s even. You can, there are examples of that. But I think some of the newer companies like SpaceX, Blue Origins, Bigelow Aerospace and so forth, they will be given the means to reinvent the wheel. I think this is the way it's going to be explained. And I think that was also part of one of the messages that Thor Han Eredyon gave to Elena Danaan, that this is the way technology is going to be released. It's going to be released as something that is new, as opposed to revealing things that have been classified for many decades. So this spaceport in Las Vegas, I think there's going to be many more of those coming online, especially once exotic propulsion systems are made available. So here is, okay, 4th of July. All right, so we just experienced the 4th of July in the United States. Now, I'm an Australian. I live and work in the United States. I've been here since 1996, so 28 years now. And one of the things that I'm greatly impressed by with the United States is its constitution. The Bill of Rights, I mean, this is something that many countries, such as Australia, don't have. We don't have a Bill of Rights like the United States. So the First Amendment, Second Amendment, and so forth. These are very important human rights that are recognized in the United States Constitution. And I think that is a very important aspect of the United States culture. But the thing that I find probably most appealing as an Australian is that you have in the United States a very clear separation of powers that the Constitution imposes, that you have a separation between the judiciary, the legislative and the executive branches of government. And also you have the division of power between the states and the federal government. And within the states, you have counties that also have certain power. And that is kind of bewildering for people coming from other countries where you have like more centralized political systems. For example, in Australia, where I come from, the state of Victoria, you have the Victoria Police Force. It's just run by the state. And then you have the federal police, which is run by the government, the federal government. In the United States, I mean, within the states, you have you have the sheriff's office operating at the county level. You have incorporated cities or townships with their own local police forces. Then you have other specialized bodies like for the state highway patrol. So you have a state police force as well, and then you have the FBI operating. So in the United States, you have a separation of powers, which you can see at all levels. And to me, this was a very great achievement by the founding fathers of the United States. And you don't get this anywhere else in the world. I mean, you don't, I mean, the US Constitution, 1996, so we're talking almost 250 years, 248 years that's been around. Other countries don't have constitutions nearly as old as that, but they certainly don't have things like a Bill of Rights. They don't have such a well-enshrined separation of powers doctrine, and where the powers between the states and the federal government are very much under debate, or that there's a separation and a very contested separation, like the different, say, the red states in the United States. They are very, very protective and of their powers, and they go to whatever length they can to ensure that the federal government doesn't encroach on state powers. Well, In other countries, you have the federal government or a unitary government that often usurps power from local bodies, or whether we're talking about county level or whether we're talking about state level. In the United States, you don't have that, and I think this was very important, especially now in the era that we live in, where the deep state has been trying to establish control over the planet, and the deep state has been working with some negative extraterrestrial groups to assert control over the planet. And the United States was always the big obstacle to that power grab, because the United States, since the Second World War, has been the uncontested, well, I shouldn't say uncontested, but has been the leading superpower. I mean, certainly you had the Soviet Union up until 1991 being a major rival to the United States, and more recently you have China becoming a rival and leading its own, or creating its own power bloc to oppose the US, and that's going to grow. But I think that for the deep state and the negative extraterrestrial groups that the deep state was involved in, for their attempt to establish a globally centralized system of governance, that they had to undermine or remove the United States. And they could not do that because of the way in which the Constitution and the separation of powers operate in the United States. It prevented this centralized globalist attempt to take over the United States. And so they've gone to plan B, which is to create a civil war in the United States, or to drag the United States into a third world war against Russia, against China. And the big benefit we have today in the United States and other countries is that there are patriots, millions of patriots, people that don't want the United States to be subsumed under a global governance system. They want the Constitution to be the single most important document in the lives of all Americans. And I think that approach actually has been very important in ensuring that our entire planet wasn't taken over and subsumed into a kind of globalist, extraterrestrial controlled entity that would do the bidding of the deep state. And so what we're heading for, I think, is something much more along the lines of a Star Trek future, where we are integrated into galactic society. So I think the United States is a very important part of that process, and I think that the Independence Day is a celebration of the achievements of the Founding Fathers in coming together and putting this Constitution in place that has lasted 250 years and protects Americans from an overreaching federal government, which may be or has been incredibly under the control of deep state aligned forces. Okay, here's an interview I did with Jelaila Starr on Galactic History. And Jelaila has always been a very impressive individual to me. I mean, I first came across her work in the early 2000s, and she took an approach to galactic conflict and conflict on Earth that resonated with me very much due to my conflict resolution background. I mean, her approach was that there needed to be an understanding of the different races and their role in galactic conflicts and in international conflicts. And she described these lion beings and these bird beings as like fifth and sixth density entities who were the founders of the genetic experiments, or they were behind the genetic experiments that led to the creation of human-looking races all over our galaxy, starting in Lyra, and of reptilian species all over our galaxy. And that these lion beings and bird beings are like the founders, they operate at a fifth, sixth density, and that the that the humans and the reptilians operate at third and fourth density, and there has been ongoing conflicts, galactic conflicts. And her approach was always to say that, well, these conflicts are just repeating patterns, and that you need to break out of these patterns. And she comes up with a novel way of breaking out of this kind of the polarity games between human-looking races and reptilian races. And so that was always very, very interesting, that we needed to look at ourselves and what we were doing, and how the other side were a mirror of that. And in the interview, we discussed the example of Mahatma Gandhi, who was someone very inspiring for me. I did my PhD thesis on Mahatma Gandhi and his philosophy, and Martin Luther King. And Gandhi, he said that, well, when you are in a struggle with an oppressive force, in the case of India, they were trying to break free of the colonial control of Britain, the British Empire. And so what Gandhi did, he took the approach of saying to his followers, like, we don't want to vilify the Brits, the British Empire. We don't want to say the white people in India are cruel colonial oppressors and we've got to get rid of them, and we will side with their enemies to at their moment of vulnerability to undermine them. So there wasn't this attempt to have India join Germany, Indian nationalists join Germany during the First or even the Second World War. And Gandhi's genius was that he recognized that there was a mirror relationship between the oppression of the British Empire over the Indian peoples and what the Indian peoples were doing today or were doing at that time to untouchables and to other disenfranchised groups within British India. And Gandhi said, look, we need to really clean up our act. We need to treat the untouchables and lower castes and disenfranchised with much more respect. We've got to recognize that they have rights and ensure that they are able to do that. And he was behind this effort for positive or reverse discrimination, where untouchables would be given preferential treatment in getting jobs in the civil service and so forth. And so that by the time the Second World War was ended, because Gandhi and British India had engaged in this non-violent effort to reform their society and to gain their independence from India, eventually India was able to achieve independence without going to war against the British Empire. And I think that was a very important lesson. And the same thing with our planet in terms of where we are heading now. We need to recognize that there are these negative extraterrestrial groups out there, the draconian reptilians, the Orion Greys that have been engaged in slave trading and so forth, that these are oppressive groups that have been preying on Earth for a long time. Now, for the time being, they've been driven off Earth because of the arrival of very positive extraterrestrial races, the Seeders, the 24 civilizations, the 9 founders and so forth. And they're here in our kind of solar system to oversee things, but we're still having to deal with the kind of the former minions of the Draco reptilians and so forth. And I think that this idea is very important, that we understand that this oppression that was done to us as a civilization is a mirror of how we treat other forms of life, like animal life. So I thought that it's a very important perspective, that these lion and bird peoples are involved in the seeding of humanity in our galaxy and on Earth, and that there's a conflict between the different races that is very ancient, and that we need to kind of we need to improve our actions so that we can recognize that there's a mirror relationship happening here in terms of what these negative extraterrestrial races did to us. and we need to kind of understand what we are doing that drew that kind of oppressive energy into our orbit. So that's the Jelaila Starr interview. So Kazakhstan has just become the 12th country to sign onto China's International Lunar Research Station initiative. So this was an initiative that China launched with Russia, but it is really China's the one that is getting other countries to sign onto the International Lunar Research Station initiative. And this is an alternative to NASA's Artemis Accords. So while Kazakhstan is the 12th country to join this International Lunar Research Station initiative launched by China and Russia, there are currently 43 nations that have signed on to the US-run space program, which is the Artemis Accords. Now, the fact that China is able to attract other countries to join onto its International Lunar Research Station initiative is a testament to its growing power, its growing technological and economic base, and the rise of the BRICS alliance. That China is getting a lot more attention and a lot more support from the international community, and it is embarked on an effort to develop a rival space bloc to the United States that is going to be in existence for decades. Now, this is a very kind of worrying concern, really, that China, supported by Russia, is setting up this rival spacefaring bloc to the Artemis Accords that has both civilian aspects and military aspects. But right now, what you have are these two blocks of nations that are coalescing in terms of civilian projects and also, to a lesser extent, military cooperation. The Artemis Accords and the military cooperation that the US Space Command is fostering, that is connected to the Artemis Accords, that is telling us that what we are seeing from the US side of things is to create a Star Trek future. And that is actually a scenario that was mapped out in a workshop at Peterson Air Force Base in 2019. It was called the Space Futures Workshop, where they mapped out over the next 40 years, by the year 2060, what would space look like? Who would be running space? So they came up with 8 scenarios, and 4 of the scenarios envisaged the United States as being the dominant space power, and another 4, well, actually, to be more correct, there were 3 where it was envisaged that the United States would be the dominant space power, 3 where China would be the dominant space power. And the optimal one for the United States was the Star Trek future, and that was the actual terminology they used. Whereas the optimal one from the Chinese perspective was something called Xi's Dream. And so what was known to the organization that organized the Space Futures Workshop, and that was the US Air Force Space Command, which was renamed or incorporated into the United States Space Force, that was created later, or in December of 2019. What they know is that there's going to be a future where you're going to have these 2 blocks of nations, one led by the US and one led by China, vying for power. And so this is what I think we are witnessing right now, that there is this formation of 2 rival space blocks. And this is a threat, a danger, because could there be war? I mean, can we expect something like the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, that happened globally? Could the same thing happen in space with a US bloc and a China-led bloc? Now, there is a lot of speculation over whether or not that's going to become ever hostile. I think there's a good case to be made that China is biding its time for when it will achieve a kind of a supremacy or a strategic advantage over the United States, where it could launch aggressive action, such as a space Pearl Harbor, where it could wipe out the US-led satellite grid, and all that would be left would be, say, China's, the Baidu, China's global satellite system. Imagine if China was to arrange or launch a kind of lightning strike to remove all of the United States satellite grid, which would mean that a lot of the smart weapons that the US uses to achieve global hegemony just wouldn't work anymore. The smart bombs and so forth wouldn't work. So yeah, there's a lot of scenarios where China could preempt or could launch a kind of space Pearl Harbor. There's a lot of concern over that, but definitely what we are seeing with this expansion of the International Lunar Research Station is that China is consolidating itself as a leading space power with a block of nations behind it, which is growing. So now I want to move to this, my last story for this week in review, which is NASA scientists speculating over the possibility of life on Europa. And that is coming from this Clipper mission that NASA is launching to the moons of Jupiter. And that's going to get to Jupiter by the end of the 2020s. And so NASA is very excited by the new data that the Clipper mission is going to be bringing in about the moons of Jupiter, Europa in particular, and they're going to be able to, they believe, get to know or get to see if it's possible that there could be life on Europa under its ice sheets. Now, we really don't have to wait for that. I mean, there's people that actually have been part of some secret space program missions to Jupiter's moon, Europa, and Ganymede and other moons of Jupiter. And JP, who's still active in the US Army, has been giving me briefings, reports, going back to, say, 2020, 2021, about different missions where he's been taken off planet. And one of the missions was he was taken to Europa and to Ganymede by a Nordic group of extraterrestrials. And in this mission report he gave me, he described what he saw under the ice sheets of Europa. And so what he described is a terrain under the ice sheets, which is very, very similar to Antarctica. Antarctica, you have these massive ice sheets, and underneath that we know that there is life, and that there are these bases that were created either by ancient extraterrestrial visitors or, say, in the 1940s by Nazi Germany. These giant bases there. Geothermal vents or geothermal heating has created these huge caverns under the ice sheets of Antarctica, and that there is a lot of water there, waterways and so forth. So according to JP, what he saw under the ice sheet of Europa is that there's a civilization there. So he described that in a story he did. And here we go. I'll go back to my story. Here's a story I did about his mission to Europa and to Ganymede. And so he described that, what he saw there. Now, here's the thing that is very important. He not only did he get to see these things, but he also got, and so here's his, for example, here's his sketch of what what he saw in one of these caverns there under Europa. Like there's an ice city there, and there are spacecraft and so forth traveling under Europa. Now, the really cool thing here about JP is that he was able to take video of the departing spacecraft. So not only did he participate in this mission to Europa, to Ganymede, as part of a convoy of Nordic spacecraft to resupply bases and facilities they have on Ganymede and on Europa. Not only did he go there to witness that this was what the Nordics wanted him to see and to report back, but after he left the spacecraft, he was able to take photos of the craft as it was leaving, and that's very helpful because it means that there is hard data, physical data, supporting what JP saw. So really, I think when we're looking at this idea of life being on Europa, and that there's kind of speculation based on new scientific missions or data coming from the James Webb Space Telescope, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that there are insiders or whistleblowers who have been to these places, either part of a secret space program or because they are working with some of the extraterrestrial groups that are helping humanity learn about what's really happening in our solar system. So there's an incredible amount of information that we already know about the moons of Jupiter. We don't have to wait for the Clipper space mission to go there and for NASA's scientists to just speculate about it all and then do the data analysis once the data comes in. It's like, there's a lot of witnesses, whistleblowers who can tell us about what's really happening on Europa and the moons of Jupiter. So that's it for the week in review. I hope you enjoy this. I'm glad I was able to get some time here during this conference in France to be able to send this to you, and I look forward to next week.
You have been listening to Exopolitics today with Dr. Michael Salla. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Join or start a conversation in the comments. Take the time to explore the vast library of best-selling books, webinars, and podcasts by Dr. Salla. Visit exopoliticstoday.com.